Blaskett with an artistic soul. He studied, he practiced, and finally reached his goal.
He didn't want to make a packet or being in a racket. He would rather be
a G-string on a fiddle in a symphony,
playing the fiddle.
Ding-bat, the singing cat. He was so cute but sang so flat all night. He'd meow and meow in a merry way.
Each night beneath the moon, the cat would croon so out of tune, but still he'd meow and meow till the break of day.
People screamed to see me out. They couldn't sleep, he sung so loud.
But someone hit him with a great big shoe,
right in the middle of his I love you.
Wow!
Ding-bat, the singing cat. He disappeared and that was that.
Now folks can sleep, they can sleep till the break of day. But then this cat went on the move, and now he's singing in the groove. He gives up with the light and shade, singing on the hit parade.
Night and day, you are the one. Only you beneath the moon and under the sun.
Now he's a cat of means.
You see his puss in magazines like
Frankie and Bing
He's got something
to sing about.
Well, that was Dingbat the Singing Cat, and I wonder whether you can tell me any guesses on who it might be. Well, if I said that my studio guest was none other than Ron Blaskett, that might give you a clue. Ron?
Thank you very much, and I feel right at home because I'm in that era of all your listeners here coming up 80 shortly. So it's lovely to be talking to us.
Well, it's delightful that you could find the time to pop in. Now, Ron, you've, of course, a household name in this state, and probably
especially in my own house.
in your own house, but particularly with your work with Gerry. And I mean, I remember as a kid coming home from school, rushing home to watch the kid shows, the Tarak show and all that sort of stuff on Channel 9. Wonderful stuff. You were born in Brunswick.
Yes, Holloway Road, Brunswick. I've only been back there once. I wonder if the house is still there that my father built with his deferred pay from the First World War.
Is that what he did?
Yes.
Yeah.
In those days, it was quite an effort to build a home. You were only talking about £200, £300 in those days. But Dad was a bank man in those days, and he was handy as a builder. And he built that home, and of course from that he led to another one in Tyler Street, Preston, then Winifred Street, Northcote, and so deferred pay went into that.
Terrific. Now, okay, was it at an early age that you got the desire for being a vent? Did you see something? Or
Yes, I did. I was 7 years of age, and Dad, who had started the Boy Scout movement in Australia and was great with kids, he took me along to a fete in Western Australia at the Gosnells Boys' Home. They sold their craft work every year, and as we went along the pathway, the stalls were empty. But there was a man doing a performance with a ventriloquist doll, I found out later, in a band rotunda. His name was Professor Turner, and in years to come, when I was back in Perth in charge of live entertainment at Channel 9, some grandkids of that man gave me his dolls, which had been under the house for years. So Sailor Jim, the particular figure he was using at that time, now resides in the Performing Arts Museum in Melbourne.
That's wonderful, isn't it?
It is,
Yeah.
and that was the start of it all. But in those days, I had no idea of how you went about it, where you've got a ventriloquial doll, and it was 13 or 14 years of age that I started to get into conjuring tricks and that sort of thing, that I found out where you could get a doll and borrowed books from libraries and learnt as much as I could about it.
So that's how you go about it. Just sort of, you trained yourself. This is how you you make the voice and all that
Well,
sort
the physical side of ventriloquism is not particularly hard, because you will have noticed when you used to go to drive-in theatres in our younger golden days, the speaker would be inside the car, but within seconds you were watching the people on the screen and the voice seemed to be emanating from them. The same would apply to your cinemascope, where you've got speakers either side, and it appears to be coming from where the eyes tell you it is. So this means that ears aren't particularly accurate in identifying the source of sound.
Right.
So ventriloquism uses that, and if it's logical, your lips aren't moving and the doll's are, that the sound is coming from him. If we had a more accurate instrument in our ears, we wouldn't be able to use ventriloquism.
Yeah.
If somebody's hammering in a place on your left outside your house, you couldn't identify whether it was left or right. You can often be fooled because you cannot tell.
That's true. Now, so you started at 7. What was the name of your first doll? It wasn't Gerry, was it?
No, it wasn't. My first doll was called Willie Ross, after a gentleman who used to broadcast on the ABC just after it opened, called John Howlett Ross, and he was an examiner in elocution at Melbourne universities and was well known as a Shakespearean actor. And I knew him, and he printed a magazine called the Australian Financial Gazette even when he was 80 years old. And he was quite a character, and so the name Ross came from there, and Willie was just a general name in those days. So Willie Ross was the first doll that I had.
Right. And can you remember where you first performed?
I certainly can. Well, the first performances in sort of unpaid performances, non-professional, were anywhere I could get an audience, be it on the fence at St Kilda Beach on the stone wall there, or on the railway station at Taronga at the end of Parslow Street. I would entertain the waiting people, the passengers.
Wonderful.
And in my book I've actually got a photo of some young fellows looking at me sitting on a railway truck that used to bring the passengers. But then the first paid show was in the city at what was called an Orange Lodge. I had no idea what an Orange Lodge was, and I didn't care much anyway. But I'd put an ad in the Age, and that cost 1 shilling and sixpence for the ad, saying that I wanted work as a ventriloquist. And a fellow called Keith Wunham, whose name I will never forget, phoned me and said, yes, we'd like to use you for 10 shillings and sixpence at our Orange Lodge. I went in there. We had to wear dinner suit. We were kept outside, and at the appropriate time after their meeting, I was brought in, and there were gentlemen sitting in dinner suits in a U formation, rather like a jury, I thought. And I did my show. Absolutely no reaction. When I'd finished this, Keith Wunham came to pay me, and he said, you were very good. You didn't move your lips once. But I didn't get one laugh. So I learned something. What's the good of being technically good if you haven't learned how to make people laugh?
Right.
But I made 9 shillings profit, so I thought, how long has this been going on? 9 shillings was a lot of money in those days.
It would be. What year would we be talking there?
Talking about 1922, 32, 36.
36.
1936.
Because you would have just been out of the Depression when things
That's
were
right.
tough.
Yes.
How did your family deal with the Depression times? Did it impact on you?
They were tough times, but not a great deal, because our table was always bountiful, and Mother was a great manager and a wonderful cook. So I didn't feel the impact, except that once I had to go to school with a patch in the back of the pants, which was not the same colour as the pants, and that mortified me, and I hated standing up at the end of the class. But generally speaking, we got through the Depression very well.
Right. Now, you mentioned when we were having a little bit of a chat before going on air that you have an affinity with Caulfield, and you thought you'd never ever be back here, but you are.
Coming back into this environment, if I see a gentleman in uniform who looks like a military man, I'll be out the door quick and lively and say, apologise to your Golden Days listeners. But I first came into the army during the war, and you were sent here to Caulfield for the first couple of nights when they distributed, you decided where you had to go. And from civilian life to the discomfort of sleeping on a palliasse, which you filled yourself with straw and had cold water to shave in, and were generally treated like, well, I won't say what you were treated like, but it was very bad, and set out to fill trucks railway trucks with wood. My hands were soft and I'd never done that sort of thing. I wondered what had struck me. It's a sudden dehumanisation process that you go through. But later on, after I got to Bendigo and was able to play a musical instrument, life became much better.
What did you do in the army? What did they?
I was eventually in charge of an army concert party. I was claimed for entertainment services, first in Victoria, in a group produced by Max Reddy, Helen Reddy's father, called the Victorian Lines of Communication Concert Party. And we had notables like Lou Tapano, the wonderful piano accordion player, Smokey Dawson, who you'd know, and eventually I became best man at Smokey's wedding, 89 and still performing. And it was a great show. So suddenly life became very good because I was entertaining, doing what I wanted to do. Prior to that, I'd won all sorts of amateur talent quests and that sort of thing. And so life became very good. And for 2 years, I was with that show. Then I got my own show and finished the war in Balikpapan. And I had Smokey Dawson still with me at that time.
Now, you mentioned Max Reddy. I've played a few programs of Max when he was at UZ and working there with
Stella.
That's with Stella.
Yes.
What was he like as a man? He seems a very funny man.
Well, we don't like to talk ill of those who have gone on, but I must say that it was one of the highlights of my life when I was able to leave his company.
Oh, well, there you go.
Even Tony in a book mentions a lot about Max, who was a stepfather, of course. But he was not the most pleasant man to work with.
Right.
But I always gave full marks to his job as a producer. He knew what he was doing. And as a producer myself in later years, I would have used his services.
Right.
But I would not have invited him into my home. No, he's not the sort of fellow I could feel any relationship with.
That's interesting. Okay, so we come to the end of the war. You're demobbed. What's the next thing for Ron Blaskett?
The next thing for Ron Blaskett is magic. I get a telegram from Colonel Jim Davidson, who'd been my boss during the war, and he'd been appointed executive producer of Tivoli shows, asking me would I appear on Clambake with George Wallace, Colin Croft and many other luminaries, and that was absolute heaven. When I showed my father the contract, he said, how can they afford to pay you that much? But in those days we were doing 12 shows a week, only had the Sunday off, and it was hard work, but you're only doing 10 minutes or so on stage. Took you an hour to make up, a lot longer than the stage work that you did. Because you wore grease paint in those days so that the spotlights and footlights wouldn't de-feature you. And so you wore full grease paint and colour, and it took about an hour to apply and make you look good. But that was a wonderful experience to be performing on the Tivoli. It was the height of every artist's ambition to appear on the Tivoli.
I've heard that from other people. Who was it? David N. Martin running the Tiv at that stage?
David N. Martin was and he'd been in real estate, made a lot of money, owned a little theatre at King's Cross, and put on shows with Ron Randall and people like that. And he was not the easiest man, and Jim Davidson found him very difficult to work with. Eventually, Davidson resigned and worked with Harry Wren for quite a while.
Oh, yes.
Harry Wren was a good entrepreneur, but a bit of a villain. But eventually, Jim retired from that sort of thing and went into doing up houses around the Burrell area, old houses, and did very well, made a lot of money out of it.
Now, you would have travelled with that Tivoli around the circuit, did that?
No, I didn't, because my other son, Ronald, who was in the studio with me, was about to be bored at that time. So I only had in my contract to do the Melbourne season.
Right.
After that, I didn't need to travel anywhere because work became so flat out in Melbourne, and freelance work where you're your own boss, and I had regular radio, that I didn't need to go anywhere else.
Now, regular radio, what, in kiddie shows or...?
Oh, heavens no. I was not a children's entertainer prior to television, although I did children's work now and again. I was an adult entertainer.
Right. And did you work with most of the major radio stations?
Yes, I worked at KZ with Norman Banks in a show called Victory Varieties.
Lovely.
I worked with Eddie Balmer, who is in his 90s, still alive and still very much with it. And what a wonderful man he was. The man who gave me lots of opportunities was Doug Elliott, who as a young man was not the ebullient fellow he became on television, but a very thoughtful young man, and he did a lot for me. He was a lot older than I was, but he was very, very good to me and gave me a lot of opportunities.
Wonderful man, Uncle Doug. Now, so that's radio. We come to perhaps the turning point in your career was 1956 television.
Yes, a little before that, because for 2 years I did demonstrations for Herald Sun of what television would be like. In other words, closed-circuit television, where from your camera, the line went direct to the set, so people could see what it would be like. It was closed-circuit.
That's interesting.
So I got ready for it. I had an absolute library of gags and ideas, and I figured that children's work, you would have a turnover audience, because a man standing up talking to doll or dolls would not last very long. So I determined to make my figure, Gerry Gee, who was made for GTV, hence the name, Gerry Gee of GTV, a living entity of the Tarak show. And he became that. For instance, he would talk to the girl next door over the fence, Elaine McKenna, later Paddy McGrath. He would go to the fish and chip shop, as everyone did on a Friday night. Frank Rich was in charge of that, a wonderful character performer. He would go for a singing lesson with the late and great Ormond Douglas, who taught him to sing and did the scales and all that sort of thing. So everyone was a particular set, not just a ventriloquist. Often I wouldn't be seen, and I had many other characters anyway. And then Denzel Housen made a series of films where Gerry Gee came to life and walked and did actions by virtue of a little boy with a mask on in long shot and cutting to close-ups of Gerry Gee's face.
I remember those.
Wonderful. They were just
those.
marvellous.
Black and white.
And Denzel's input and work on that was marvellous, so much so that they sent us around the world to make a series of Around the World with Gerry Gee for Channel 9.
Now, just while we're talking about, we've just started talking about television, there's lots to come. Where was Gerry created? Was he from America?
Yes, he was. He was made in Chicago by a wonderful man called Frank Marshall, who carved for professional ventriloquists around the world. And in fact, years and years before, he'd made Charlie McCarthy for Edgar Bergen, Candice Bergen's father. Yeah. And Edgar Bergen was very wealthy. He made a lot of money, but his daughter Candice makes more in a year than he made in a lifetime. Yet in those days he had his own twin-engine aeroplane, and in my book, You, Me and Gerry Gee, there's a photo taken with Edgar Bergen, and you can see the likeness of Frank Marshall's work by the eyes. The figures always had those almond-shaped Nefertiti eyes, as I call them. So you can pick a Marshall doll anywhere, but they were unique because they were carved in wood. So they had an essential character, whereas the English dolls were made in a common mould out of papier-mâché, and they all looked the same.
What was the wood?
It was a basswood.
Ah, okay, fine. So we're at Channel 9, we're at the Tarak show. At that point in time, who was it Happy Hammond there?
Yes, Happy Hammond. What happened was I was to work with Cliff Witter, Nicky, who'd been working with Graham, was a wonderful performer. I'd worked with him many, many times. He was to work with me, and Norm said, I think we'll use you and Nicky in the children's show. And I thought, well, that suits me, that's common sense. And just before we were to do the tests of Mount Dandenong, we got the news that Nicky had passed away. And in Nancy Lee's book, she mentions this, that he was to do the children's show. Yes. And we wondered who on earth we'd get. Well, Happy Hammond came to light, and I must say that he was marvellous. He had that eye communication with the audience that so many others from radio didn't, because their eyes darted all over the place instead of talking directly to the viewer. But Happy could do that. He had a great happy disposition. He was a warrior off camera, but my word, he projected on television.
I always remember him with that pork pie sort of hat with the tartan and the jacket, and that happy, infectious smile. He would look at you, as you were saying. He looked at that camera and he would say, and he'd click those fingers, and you felt good.
Yes. The clicking of the fingers is a strange thing. He probably only did it once a year, but it's gone into our mind because every retrospective shows that particular bit.
That's exactly right.
And I heard one of our current high-profile radio announcers, somebody said to him, the children's shows were pretty good in those days, although a bit amateurish. Well, television itself was amateurish because it was new. We were all learning.
Of course it was.
But the people on it were very professional in their work.
And the thing about that, was that you had to do it on the fly. You didn't have the benefit of videotape and editing and so on and so forth.
Live to
It was
air,
live
warts and
to
all.
air, and it was warts and all, as you say.
Well, this high-profile bloke responded to that by saying, "Oh yes, blokes in funny hats clicking their fingers." I thought, well, that was a put down because he only did it once a year.
Yeah.
This fellow on air was obviously only 7 or 8, but it's in the retrospects that they show, going back to that time, that's got into his head that that's all he did. But he was far more than that.
They would have been happy days for you with that particular production.
You were caught up in an excitement. We worked extremely hard. There was nobody to do the writing, so Denzel Housen worked like blazes, and so did I, writing new material, new ideas, getting out of this look of a talking doll aspect, making the characters come alive, and training young lasses into doing lines and that sort of thing. Thank goodness we had professionals like Margot Sheridan who could look after the musical side. Eventually we had a 3-piece band in the show, Laurie Wilson on Hammond organ, Billy Hunter on drums, and it came to life, and it was a show that you will never see the likes of because it would cost too much money nowadays.
Yeah, that's right.
Sir Arthur Warner was making a fortune selling 17-inch black and white sets, so he didn't mind putting money back into live TV.
How long were you with the Tarak show in total?
I was there for about 10 years, and then I started to produce shows, other shows, a quiz show in particular, with a well-known hypnotist. Now, he was fine as a hypnotist, but he could not do a quiz show.
Right.
We had no videotape except edit going back to the commercial break. So if he made a mistake, you'd have to go back to the commercial break. That blew all your questions for that contestant. And if the one who was winning at that time lost, he was going crook. And we had a dreadful time with this fellow. So much so that the sponsors Shell were up the wall. I was up the wall. And he sent a 2-page notice to the boss about the lighting not being right. He was talking about stage lighting, not television lighting, so he didn't know what he was doing.
No.
And thank goodness the show disappeared. Then I got an offer to go to Perth in charge of live television with Denzel as program manager. That was heaven.
That was for 9 Network?
Yes, not network.
No,
there was no network.
Channel
in those
9.
days. Channel 9 Perth, which was owned by a number of businessmen.
Did you
there.
enjoy that?
Very much so. I had 4 years, and you never said you came from the East, or they dubbed you the wise men from the East. So you went very quietly, because they were in a very laid-back sort of attitude in Perth. Manana was very much in their mind.
Right.
But Denzel and I managed to weather all that sort of thing, and we had a wonderful 4 years there. Then my parents were getting old. My eldest son was here on his own in Melbourne, and the call of coming back home was very strong. So I came back to Melbourne, and from then on I was my own boss, and thank heavens I had a wonderful 30 years after that working for myself.
Right, and that entailed doing just general gigs around?
General work, young talent time regularly, at least once a month, comparing when Johnny Young went on holidays,
Right.
and doing all their tours with all the famous ones who were kids then. You think of the young Minogue, Danny Minogue, Tina Arena, Debbie Byrne. They were all in the show. Philip Gould. Every one of them has done so well.
Yeah.
And doing the tours in every state was a great money earner for me.
Well, that's great.
And during that time, I went to Vietnam twice. I did Expo in Canada.
Montreal.
Yes, no, Toronto.
Toronto.
Yes,
Oh, right.
Toronto. And I went to Compare for the Footscray Yarraville band.
Oh, yeah.
And there are a lot of very professional players in that band. And I beat Christopher Scase's father, Charles Scase, for the job because I knew a lot about brass band music. And that was a wonderful experience when the Footscray Yarraville band cleaned up the whole world. They were the best in the world and won that competition at Toronto.
Yes.
And then I've been back to America working as late as 1983 in Cincinnati.
Yeah, well, we have a brass band program on the station, and I think the presenter has made mention of the fact that they went over and cleaned up at that.
Merv Simpson was the conductor.
right, yeah,
And
yeah.
they were fabulous.
Yeah.
You had George Dobson and a lot of famous players in it who were just wonderful. They'd been in the Channel 9 Orchestra and so on.
Yeah.
But to be there and comparing a show, and suddenly you didn't realise it was going to happen, but this band from Melbourne beat the world. The Black Watch Band and all the other famous bands around the world.
Yeah.
Here they were cleaning up way ahead of anyone else.
Indeed. Now, look, we've got another piece of music here. I think we can probably play that and just have give you a voice.
I'm glad you called it music, Alex, because what we hear today, I doubt is music, it's noise, isn't it?
No, well, this is right. And this is Gerry, and again with the Tune Twisters.
Yes.
Knick, Knack, Paddy, Whack.
Oh, it fits right in with your
Well, let's
audience.
have a listen to this, and then we'll come back for a closer.
Knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. This old man comes rolling home. Knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. This old man comes rolling home. He plays 2, he plays 3, he plays knick-knack on my tree. With a knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. This old man comes rolling home.
My, oh my, poor old guy. Oh, knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. This old man comes rolling home. Knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. This old man comes rolling home. He plays 2, he plays 3, he plays knick-knack on my tree. Knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. This old man comes rolling home. My, oh my, poor old guy. Knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. The old man's rolling home. Knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. The old man's rolling home. He plays 5, he plays 6, he plays knick-knack on my sticks.
With the knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. This old man comes rolling home.
My, oh my, poor old guy. Playing that knick-knack,
Playing a knick-knack.
knick-knack.
Knick-knack, paddywhack. Gerry there, and once again with the Tune Twisters, Ron, sounding terrific.
Yeah, beautiful words, aren't they? Our golden days, people will remember that from their childhood.
They will indeed. Now, look, you've got a story to tell us, I think, haven't you?
Yes. Do you recall, Alex, the little man who taps on the window in Swanston Street?
R.I.P Alexander.
That's right, yes. Well, I wrote a little jingle and did a commercial every Friday night on In Melbourne Tonight for R.I.P Alexander. And from a little tailor, he became a manufacturing-to-measure tailor. It became a huge business. But the little man who taps on the window, we wondered what had happened to him. He turned up on a rubbish tip in Sydney, and the man who found him has restored him, and he's now in Haig's Chocolates in the Block Arcade, and I will be reunited with him on Tuesday, March the 19th, when I go into the Block Arcade to sign my book, You, Me and Gerry Gee, and it will be fantastic to see the little man who taps on the window
It
again.
will. I mean, that brings back memories to me as a kid. I used to be fascinated by this little man tapping on the window. And you wrote the tune. That's terrific.
I wrote the tune, and in there at the Block Arcade on March 19, I'll have Gerry Gee and Adolphus Twerk on show there,
Right.
which will be great.
Now, Gerry resides in the Performing Arts Museum, doesn't he now?
No, he does not.
Oh.
No.
What did I read? Where did I read?
No, Joel sold him at auction because my second son, Peter, who does the Gerry Gee 2 show now,
Right.
had another American doll. He felt that he didn't want to have Dad's doll.
Okay.
It was sitting in a case. A lot of people wanted. We didn't want to show favouritism, so Joel's put him up for auction. Channel 9 bid for $15,000 because they're not interested in any shows but the show that's a Now show to air now, and rightly so. They're not a museum. But a gentleman called Mr. Bongiorno bid to $18,700, so he has him, treasures him, and looks after him.
Lovely.
But we are able to borrow Gerry Gee and have him on show. And Adolphus Twerk, the original Adolphus Twerk, the fellow who used to talk, "Oh, good eye, Alex. How are you? Are you smart Alex or the big Alex
I
or
love it.
Alexander?"
I love it.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Brings back a lot of memories from me as a kid. Ron, your book is out and available for sale, You, Me and Gerry Gee, which is 60 years of marvellous anecdotes And
photos too.
And photos. The photos are brilliant.
Aren't they?
It is just a wonderful publication, and it is available for at most of the good bookshops around town. But there's
Dimmick's, Elston, and Campbell will have got it. The Arts Centre shop under that tower where the seagulls fly.
Is the 1-800 number still working?
Yes, Mitties in the city have got it.
Yeah.
But it's a free call, and I suggest to Golden Days listeners to get the book. It's so convenient. You just ring 1-800. Now, you can remember 1-800. That's the free call, so don't worry about that too much. But remember this number, 88 22224. And it'll be delivered to your door.
Wonderful.
And I can assure you that you'll be thrilled to bits, because it is an encyclopedia of show business in Melbourne.
And I think you're a bit of an encyclopedia too, Ron. You've had a wonderful life in show business.
You can't shut me up as easily as an encyclopedia, though.
You've had a marvellous life in show business, and we do thank you so very much. And let's hope we can do it again sometime.
Well, Alex, your name couldn't be Hee-Ha. How do you pronounce your second name? Hare. That's what we all need a bit of.
Think so.
Alex, it's been lovely to meet you and talk to all your listeners.
Thank you, Ron Blaskett.